Bulletin to our next reading on the book of Ruth. Today we'll be going through chapter 2 and seeing how the story that began last week continues. If you remember, it ended with a sense of emptiness. But there was that last little clue. The very last verse in the chapter said, they arrived just as the barley harvest was beginning, sort of giving us this sense of wait and see what happens next. So now we turn to Ruth 2 to see just exactly what does happen next. Please follow along in your bulletins. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The word of the Lord. Please pray with me. Lord, there are so many times throughout the week, throughout our life, where we feel like we are just gleaning and picking up scraps. Yet you invite us to come to you and be filled, to have more than enough, to eat our fill and have enough to take home to others. Lord, fill us during this time this morning. Amen. How many times have you seen this sort of scene happen in a movie where there's a new girl at school, and she just arrives, and she's new to town. She doesn't really know anybody. It's her first day at school. She's a little shy. She's just trying to get by, when, wouldn't you know it, she's walking down the hallway, and bam, she runs into someone, and her books and her papers go flying everywhere. Oh, how embarrassing for this girl. Her first day, she doesn't know anyone, so she bends down to pick up her books and her papers, and wouldn't you know it, the person she ran into bends down too, and just for a moment their hands touch, and then they look up at each other, and oh, it's the high school quarterback, the senior, and they stand up, and he says something clever, and she's just shy, says something nervous, and then they have their quintessential meet cute. This is how the story begins, something like this. 3,000 years before the first ever shy new girl ran into the quarterback of the football team in a high school anywhere, Boaz and Ruth had the original meet cute. Ruth is out there gleaning the barley harvest when she meets this, strong guy who runs the field with integrity, and they have this little moment. It's the original meet cute, and it takes the center stage in our reading this morning, this interaction between these two. But before that happens, the narrator actually sets the story up in a very intentional way. So before we look at the relationship that is just beginning and blossoming between Boaz and Ruth, I want us to look at what this word is that the narrator slides into the very first verse of chapter 2. It mentions that she has a relative, but actually this word relative, it doesn't quite do it justice to describe the relationship that Boaz has to Naomi and to Ruth. It's actually the same word that's used in verse 20 when Naomi says, "Oh, this man is our guardian redeemer." The Hebrew word is, "This man is our goel." It means somebody who is in charge of making sure everyone in the family is taken care of. Somebody with that title had actually a very specific role and responsibilities for their family, for their kin. This redeemer had the responsibility to do a number of things. In ancient Israel, it was their job and their duty to purchase anybody back who had sold themselves into slavery. So say somebody had gone into debt and they needed to pay back their money, so they would sell themselves out to be a servant to someone else. It was the goel's duty to go to that somebody else and pay the amount that they owed, so that this brother or sister could be brought back into the family. It was also the redeemer's responsibility that if anybody in the family had sold part of the family land, to make some quick cash or something like that, it was the goel's responsibility to purchase that land back, to make sure that the family plot stayed together. If you're familiar with Jesus' story of the prodigal son, where the younger son sells off the land and goes out, and then he ends up selling himself into servitude, it was actually the older brother's responsibility to bring him back. His job would have been to be the goel. So that's what this family culture was like back then. People had duties and responsibilities to their family to make sure every member was cared for, to make sure every member was free, to make sure that the family land stayed together. And it was even the goel's responsibility to make sure that if a member of the family died, leaving behind a widow with no other heir to her name, it was the goel redeemer's responsibility to make sure that she was taken care of. In many cases, to bring her into his own family, to make sure that she would have a future and that she would be taken care of. We'll see that role come into play a little later. Essentially, if you want to know what a goel, a kinsman redeemer, a guardian redeemer's responsibility is, it's to see, to care, and provide for the most vulnerable members of their family, to see what's going on, to care for the people that are entrusted to them, and provide for the people that they're responsible for. So it's this understanding, introduced right at the very first verse of the chapter, that sets up the tension for the rest of the story. It says, oh, by the way, Naomi and Ruth have this guardian redeemer named Boaz. And then it goes into the story. And we're left wondering, are they ever going to meet? Are they going to realize that he's a guardian redeemer? Is this ever going to, mean anything? It creates this tension that we then see play out afterwards. So let's see how the rest of the story goes as we, the audience, get this little piece of information beforehand. So it begins with Ruth heading out the door to go and glean for herself and for Naomi. Now, there were very specific laws in the Hebrew Bible about what gleaning meant. God wrote in his laws to his people that when you plant a field and when you harvest it, you're not to harvest all the way to the edges of the field. You are to leave those alone. You're to leave the edges of your field unharvested for the poor, for the foreigners, for the widows, for those immigrating through so that they might have something to eat as well. And also when you harvest and you gather in your grain, and you're going through the field, you're picking it, you're harvesting it, you're bringing it to the barn. After you're done, don't go through a second time to pick up whatever's been dropped or whatever's been left behind or forgotten. Leave that there on the ground. Leave that as well for the poor, for the immigrant, for the foreigner, that they might be taken care of as well. God had very specific laws to make sure that everybody, even the most vulnerable people in Israel, would be taken care of. But also remember that this whole story is taking place during the time of the judges, where it's very explicitly said this was a time when there was no king in Israel and everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. You can probably bet that many landowners were not following these kinds of practices. And yet here we see someone who is. Now, as Ruth leaves, Naomi sends her off with this parting blessing. Go, my daughter. Now, this might be something we completely skip over or wouldn't notice, but all of chapter 1, Ruth has been referred to as Naomi's daughter-in-law, her daughter-in-law, the Moabite, the Moabitess, the foreigner. It goes through all of these great lengths to emphasize the distance that Ruth has to Naomi, that she is other, that she is this other person, that they're not really that close. But then you see here that Naomi sends her off with this greeting, or this sending, saying, go, my daughter. No, she's no longer my daughter-in-law. She's no longer this foreigner who is just tagged along with me on my journey home. She says, go, my daughter. Just emphasizing the closeness of the relationship that now exists between Naomi and Ruth. Really, you think about it, they are all that each other has in the world at this point. So she sends her out, and Ruth goes, and if you were to do a literal translation of verse 3, it would say that she chanced her chance to come upon Boaz's portion of the land, saying she just so happened to wind up at the field of the person mentioned earlier, who is the guardian redeemer for Ruth and for Naomi. We're getting these subtle or not really so subtle hints from the narrator that God is orchestrating things here. That God is at work guiding Ruth to the right place to meet the right people so that his plan can play out. And now finally, we come to the moment of truth in this chapter. The moment we've been waiting for. Ruth and Boaz are finally in the same scene together. And in this opening scene, we learn quite a bit about both of them, about Ruth and Boaz. We learn more about both of their characters. We get to see this new side of Ruth here that we didn't maybe know before. Boaz asks about her, and the servant notes she's been working on her feet all morning. She's barely taken a break. We see that she's taking this duty to glean and get enough food for her and Naomi seriously. She is scouring the field for scraps. She is hard at work all morning, barely taking a break to get enough for her and Naomi. She is that dedicated to taking care of her new, essentially adopted mother. Now, if you're familiar with the book of Proverbs, you might know about the Proverbs 31 woman. It's this soaring poem at the end of the book of Proverbs about the wife of noble character. It describes her as this industrious woman who works well with her hands and has a sharp mind. She could run a business. She's somebody who puts the term girl boss to shame. Proverbs 31 woman is the epitome of what women were aiming for in traditional Jewish culture. And Jewish tradition held up Ruth as the ultimate exemplar of what a Proverbs 31 woman is. We see that in the way that she is hard at work, taking care of her adopted mother, Naomi. And at the same time, while this is going on, and Boaz is talking with the overseer of the workers and the gleaners, we learned some interesting things about him too. I think one of the most striking things is the fact that Boaz recognizes that there's a new gleaner out there. It tells us a lot about his character. It means that he knows the gleaners that are in his field. This would be like the CEO of a company recognizing when they hire a new cleaning lady. Or maybe even more accurate example would be the CEO of a company recognizes when there's a new person asking for change outside of his building. This is somebody who knows the people that work for him. This is somebody who knows the people that gather around to pick up the scraps. This is somebody who doesn't consider himself too important for the little people. This is somebody who actually wants to know their stories. He knows the people that are gleaning. And so when he sees that there's somebody new, he wants to know who she is. What's her story? What brings her here? She's new. How can we bring her into this community that we've formed here? And so as the man responds, he says, well, this is Naomi's daughter-in-law, Ruth, the Moabite. And when he realizes that he's the woman that he's heard about, he's heard this story about her before, that she's the one who showed this remarkable, if you remember from last week, this remarkable chesed love to her mother-in-law, Naomi. He realizes that this is the person I've heard stories about. And so when he hears that, he calls her over and he says these shocking things to her. What he says to her is shocking on multiple levels. On the first hand, it's shockingly generous what he does for her. He says, not only are you allowed to glean here in my field, but actually, I want you to keep coming back and exclusively glean in my field. I want to make sure that he wants to make sure that she's safe and unbothered. He's providing her water from his own water jars. He's going way above and beyond what would be expected from someone like him to someone like her. All of this is shockingly generous, but if you look at the subtext of the words that he's saying, it's also shockingly promiscuous, the things that he's saying to her. There's a lot of double entendres in the words that he's using that we would miss if we're not familiar with that culture and what those words and phrases meant. So let's look at these. What he says to Ruth, first of all, he's saying, please don't go anywhere. He's saying, please stay. Stay close to me. I want you nearby. You'll find everything that you need here. I'll make sure of it. You can glean here in fellowship with the other women. You'll be taken care of. The actual word that he uses is cling to them. Cling is this Hebrew word, dabak, which is usually used when it's referring to a married couple, saying that a husband will leave his father and mother and will cling to his wife. So this charged word is introduced into what he's saying to her. He says, I will make sure nobody touches you. This is literally means I will make sure nobody molests you. I'll make sure that you are not taken advantage of. And this is that nobody will bother you with any of these unwanted advances against you. This is particularly important to remember that during this time, everybody's doing what was right in their own eyes. And a foreign woman like Ruth coming into a society like this, where there is no king and everything is rather chaotic, would have been the most vulnerable person for someone to take advantage of. She would have been completely vulnerable, an easy target for a man without virtue. And so Boaz is saying, stay with me, and I will make sure that nobody will make any of these unwanted advances against you. And then at the end, he says, drink from the waters that I have prepared. Again, this is this very loaded image in Hebrew culture. The relationship between a man and a wife is described as drinking from his cistern, the water jar. That's the words that are used to describe the intimate relationship between a husband and a wife, is to drink from his cistern. And here he's saying to her, I have these water jars here for you to drink from. In these two short verses, they're loaded with these evocative marriage references. Nothing overt or indecent, but it has lots of suggested wordplay that's introduced here. And so we're starting to see that there's sort of this charged tone between Ruth and Boaz already. So Ruth bows in gratitude. She knows that what he's offering her is far more than what he needs to do for her. She hasn't earned this kind of treatment. She doesn't know that yet she has this relationship to him. She just comes and is one of these members of the field, and yet he goes way out of his way to make sure she is taken care of above and beyond. But Boaz, actually, he doesn't even stop there. He goes even further. He invites her to dine with him. And they're having lunch, and he invites her to come. And they have this meal together. This could possibly be their first date. And as they're eating, what do they eat? Well, they eat bread and wine. Very interesting that this is the choice of meal that they have. And after the meal, he sends her home with food. And this is the part where I think Boaz might actually be part Filipino, because he sends Ruth home with this baon for his mother-in-law, Naomi, which is a very Filipino tradition if you've ever been to a party where you are always sent home with lots of food to bring home to the people of your house. And finally, after the meal, Ruth, she goes back to the field to glean. And while she goes, Boaz continues to show generosity to her by saying to his workers, look, I want you to take extra special care of Ruth. This is what he says. He arranged this thing behind the scenes with his workers to make her job even easier. So that as she's out there gleaning, he instructs them, what I want you to do is that while you're harvesting, I want you to take whole handfuls of grain and leave them on the ground for her. I want you to intentionally drop more so that there's enough for her to pick up. And actually, not only that, but as you're harvesting the grain and you're putting them into bundles and you're stacking them ready to be picked up, I want you to take grain from the stacked bundles. And I want you to tell her that she can take grain from the stacked bundles that have already been harvested. He's making sure that she benefits from the hard work that others have done, that normally would have been designated for himself. He's going way, 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 way out of his way to make sure that Ruth is taken care of above and beyond. So Ruth goes home. It says she's carrying an ephah of grain. This is enough grain to bake 60 loaves of bread. And she walks in the door, and I can just imagine Naomi's eyes popping out of her head, expecting Ruth to come back from a hard day of gleaning, come back sweaty, dirty, with whatever handful of grain she could have picked up off the ground. But instead, she comes in hauling this massive sack of grain into their home, and she drops it on the ground. And this is enough food for months. And so she just says to her, "Where did you glean today?" And Ruth tells her all about Boaz. And I love Naomi's subtle suggestion to Ruth. Well, it's better to go back to his field, Ruth. You might be bothered somewhere else. I can just hear the tone of a mom or an auntie who's trying to get this girl married. Like, it's better to go to his, Ruth. He invited you. It'd be rude not to show up and to go back again tomorrow. We get this wonderful scene in this story. At the end of chapter 2, we see that the tension, it's been played with, but not finally addressed. We see actually that Boaz is already acting like a guardian redeemer before he or Ruth even realized that they technically already had that relationship. So we see that he would be the perfect guardian redeemer. But we're left with this question, will he actually take that responsibility formally? We're left to wonder. We see the perfect solution in Boaz to Ruth and Naomi's problem. And now we're left to wonder, will it come together? Could this story actually have a happy ending after all? We see in Boaz him acting like a guardian redeemer. He sees Ruth. He notices her gleaning with the other women. He sees that she's new. Not only does he see, but he cares. He cares for Ruth. He's moved by her story. He wants her to be taken care of. Already, you can pick up the emotional bond that's developing between these two. He sees her, he cares for her, and he provides for her. Not only does he provide her enough food for daily bread, which would have been, the expected role for someone gleaning in their field, but he goes well beyond what would be considered generous. He gives her enough food for a month. Not only this, he provides her a protected place at his estate, and he provides a hope and a future for both Ruth and Naomi. We see that Boaz sees, he cares, he provides. He's fulfilling all of the roles he's supposed to fill. Now we just have to wonder, is he going to take that role officially on himself? This is the love story. This is how the love story between Ruth and Boaz begins. And if you're a Christian, that means that you have a story actually just like this. You have a story like this too. Whenever a Christian tells a story about how God came into their life, sometimes we call this a testimony about how God came into our life, how my life was different before and after. You know what that story always includes? It always includes a meet cute. We might not use that term in our Christian testimony, but every Christian has a point in their story where God entered and they felt seen. They finally felt seen. And as things progress in this relationship, you become aware that God not only sees you, but he cares for you. You feel seen, you feel cared for. And not only does he see and care for you, but at a certain point in your story, you realize that he has provided so much for you. That he has provided even his own son for you, that you could have a future with him. Every Christian has the same story as Ruth and Boaz. I was thinking about this in a lot of ways. Every Christian could say this kind of story that would map onto the story of Ruth and Boaz. I could say this even about my own story of becoming a Christian, that there was a time in my life that I didn't even know I had a guardian redeemer. That I didn't know that this relationship existed. But when I was empty and needy and not sure how I was going to get by, he noticed me. That he saw me gleaning out in the fields, picking up scraps, trying to put a life together, being empty, going here and there, trying to pick up enough things that maybe would satisfy, and always coming up short, trying and failing to piece a life together by just picking scraps up off the ground, the leftovers. When God noticed me and called me over, and he says, stop gleaning for scraps in these other fields and stay here with me. There's even a community of other gleaners that I have here for you to join and be a part of. I will watch over you. I will make sure that anybody who would have harmed you in those other fields that you've been gleaning in will not lay a finger on you while you're with me. When you are thirsty, I provided water for you. If you are hungry, come dine at my table. Come stay with me as you glean in my field. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be pulling handfuls of my own goodness and righteousness to lay down for you to pick up. I'm going to be doing all of the work of the harvest and letting you reap the rewards. I'll make sure you get the reward even for the work that I've done on the cross. I'll lay that down, the reward that I've earned for my perfect life. I'm going to harvest it and leave it for you to pick up so that you can be filled. I'll do the work for you. Just stay near me. Don't go back. Don't go back to begging for scraps in these other fields that have never satisfied you. Stay here with me. I will do all the work for you. Just stay. The gospel, the good news is this, that Christ is your guardian redeemer. He sees you. He cares for you, and he's provided his own life for you. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for seeing us when we felt so unseen, for seeing us as we try to piece a life together by picking up scraps, for seeing us and caring for us enough to draw us into your presence, to invite us to come and sit at your table, for caring enough to bring us in. And God, we thank you so much for providing everything that we need, providing your Son, even, that we might find a place in your home. And may our story mirror this story between Ruth and Boaz, that we might know the love that you share for us and see you as our guardian redeemer. Amen.